Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value, but also add up to the big improvements and revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. And today I'm talking to Troy Hunt, information security author and instructor, and the MS Regional Director and MVP, and also founder of HaveIBeenPwnd. Troy, thanks for joining me today. Really pleased to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. My pleasure, mate.
So, Troy, tell us a little bit about your background and how you arrived at this point as a resource for security professionals, somebody that I think many people look up to, and the developer of a website that I think is, becoming increasingly a central tenet of security practice as a resource to try and combat some of the challenges that we have in securing our data.
Well, it's funny, I was just thinking yesterday, it's sort of gotten to be a big thing now, and I was thinking back to when I started it, and really the genesis was I had downtime in a hotel room in the Philippines and I was bored. Like that was the beginning. I guess a little bit more deeper than that. The two sort of objectives I had originally was one, to actually provide the service as it stands today, insofar as there's somewhere you can go and see where you've been exposed. And part of it also was that I wanted to build some stuff in anger, so to speak. I wanted to build something on Azure in particular, because I was starting to do a lot of work with the platform back in my old corporate job. And I really wanted to sort of build something that was actually used by people and had a bit of scale to it. And honestly, they were the objectives, and I just didn't see it going to where it is today.
So it's really become, just based on even recent news, people are now starting to incorporate it. I know you've made some changes to the tool set that allows for that to be a little bit more flexible. But let me ask, out the gate, one of the things that occurs to me, and just to be clear, I'm a big fan, but it feels like this is just this wonderful honeypot for hackers to go after and say, wow, this is this great resource. I've got this massive user ID and password database. What's your position on that?
Yeah, look, it's something I give a heap of thought to, and I actually wrote a blog post, it must have been 6-9 months ago, something like that, called The Ethics of Running a Data Breach Service. And there's always this balancing act, I guess, in anything we do in life, but certainly in security as well, where we're saying, look, there's a whole bunch of upside insofar as, we get people to figure out their exposure, they can take preventative measures, all the rest of it. And then there's obviously downsides as well. And part of the potential downside is, look, it does make people more discoverable in terms of where they've been in data breaches. So what I have to try and do is keep sort of reassessing that balance, doing everything I can to maximize the upsides and minimize the downsides. So, the upsides will be things like trying to make information more discoverable for people via some of the partnerships I announced yesterday. And mitigating the downsides will be things like, look, let's try and, for example, ensure that you're never publicly discoverable in a sensitive data breach. Let's have a lot of rate limits and other sort of malicious activity defenses to try and minimize the potential to do nasty things with it. And so long as that balance is still in favor of running it as it is, that's fantastic. And as and when it changes, and certainly it has changed over time, I'll adapt accordingly.
I would say one of the other things that I've seen that you've done, you've talked about this, is that, very much in line with your ethical concept is, it's not, oh, here's the data, I'm just going to throw it in. You actually have a very rigorous process that you go through to validate that as best as you can. I mean, nothing's perfect at this point. Can you share a little bit of the detail of that?
Yeah, so when we see data in a quote unquote breach, and I say it like that because often things are claimed to be a breach and they turn out not to be, I think it's really important to sort of establish the legitimacy of these. So, a really good example of this is I will see people package up data that's been repurposed. So it might have appeared in other breaches, it might have just been taken from random locations. And they will say, for example, this is the Yahoo breach. And these are sort of legitimate accounts and passwords and so on from Yahoo. Here's a sample. I want notoriety or money or something like this. This is obviously the people sending the data. And you've got to sort of say, well, look, let's actually make sure this is what you say it is. So the verification process is enormously important, not least of which because if I get it wrong, the impact, particularly on the organization implicated as having a data breach, could be really bad. Now, I don't want to go out there and say, look, hey, Acme Core had a breach, here's their data. And then it turns out they didn't, and this has done Acme Core damage. That may not work out well for me, as well as not working out well for them.
Yeah, no, so that's exactly right. And so worth sharing a little bit of what sits behind the scenes and some of the changes that you've applied and some of the things that are now we're seeing happening in general that are improving that service. So I can't tell you exactly, I know you probably can, how old this is. I certainly remember it when it first showed up, thought it was quite innovative. It's gotten bigger, better. Tell us a little bit about that and what you've done to sort of keep that progress and improvement going.
Well, for context, it appeared, I think it was December 2013. So at the time of recording, we're about 4.5 years in, which actually now starts to seem quite old. The penny's just dropped. So look, over that time, there's just been loads of incremental changes, and maybe the fact that it is relatively old, I guess, in internet terms, sort of helps account for how it is where it is today. So over that time, it started as pretty much what you see today, same design, same feature, big text box on the front page, whack your email address in, I'll tell you where you've been seen. And then it quickly expanded in things like the notification service because people want to know if they get exposed somewhere after they do a search. So now there's just over 2 million people subscribed to that service. The domain search, companies want to know when they've been exposed. In fact, one of the things that's really surprised me is the nature of some of the organizations in there monitoring their own domains. And it's just about everyone you can think of. Like that's probably the easy way to put it. Every now and then I sort of go through and do a check against like the Fortune 500, and it's a significant portion of them, as well as governments and military and all sorts of other things. So there's sort of been this constant feed of features. The other thing that's really taken off, particularly I would say over probably the last 6 months, is sort of the mainstream legitimization, for want of a better term. And I'm seeing that manifest itself through channels such as earlier this year, I announced the Australian and UK governments are using the service. And this was something which has been a little bit of a work in progress, initially with the UK and then Australia, to make sure that governments have access to data about their own domains. And it was I guess a bit of a coup to get to the point where both those governments and subsequently the Spanish government as well, and several others in the works, we're happy to sort of say publicly, look, we're using this service run by this Aussie bloke with billions of stolen records in it, and we're happy to talk about it. Like that I did not see coming. And I think that sort of possibly happened because of the work I've been trying to do in legitimizing the service itself and what I've been doing. So things like speaking at Congress last year was a big boost to I guess, I keep using the word legitimize, but I can't think of a better term, like make it more legit in terms of the nature of the service. And as time's ticking by, we're just seeing it get more and more into the mainstream to the point where we're now seeing some pretty major platforms and even the Firefox browser starting to integrate the service. And that's sort of really shifted gear this year.
So as you think about individuals, so we all face this. I think the reality is if you haven't been breached, it's only a question of when. And that being the case, there's lots of sort of conflicting advice. There are challenges with password requirements in different systems. Tell us, how do you, you obviously have your own system. How do you approach this, and how should people think about this from a password standpoint so that they can try and keep their information secure, given that there's an expectation at some point it's going to be breached?
Well, it's a bit of a tricky thing insofar as, look, on the one hand, you're right. We've got to acknowledge that it's probably going to be breached one day, well beyond any control we have. But on the other hand, the ways that we can mitigate the risk are also profoundly simple. And it really just boils down to a password manager. And you know that we have this sort of interesting thing with passwords where they have prevailed probably long beyond the time that they should have. We know that there's fundamental problems with reuse of passwords, with weak passwords, all these other sorts of things. But we also know that on the other hand, that the usability of a password is off the chart. It's the easiest thing in the world to use as some form of authentication, and this is why they stick around. So we have to recognize that passwords are still here. They're going to still be here for a very long time too. We're not about to see the death of it. The stories of its death have been largely exaggerated. It's still there. So how are we going to make the most of it? Well, this whole premise of strength and uniqueness is really the cornerstone to passwords. And your brain is not very good at doing strong, unique passwords across the breadth of accounts we have today. Look, it was a different story sort of 10 or 15 years ago where we had a small number of accounts. These days, pretty much everyone has some number of dozens of accounts in different places. Now, your brain is just not going to scale in terms of strong, unique stuff. And every time I hear someone say theirs does, it doesn't. Like you pick away at it, it just doesn't work. So we need a tool, and that tool is a password manager. And the password manager unburdens you of the mental duress of trying to create strong, unique passwords, because now all your strong, unique passwords go into something which does remember it very well, being a very strongly encrypted, dedicated software package, and you remember a single password to unlock it. And honestly, I can't think of a single person who uses a password manager and ever says this wasn't a good idea. Normally the people that are reticent about password managers are the ones who are not using them and haven't quite seen the upsides yet. So really, that's the only good mechanism we have at the moment, and it is a fantastic mechanism, and it works very well when you use them properly.
So I'm a big fan, user for a long time. There's a number of them out there. I'll tell you one of the things that I've come across that I find frustrating, and I'd love to hear your comments about it. In certain corporate circumstances, they won't allow for the password manager to be installed, or they have policies that limit your ability to change or add things. How do you deal with that?
This is a fun chat. So I go into a lot of organizations, and I'll give you a good example. I was at a bank last month, and I spent the day in the bank doing multiple talks to ultimately thousands of people about security. And this was during Scam Awareness Week. So it's when everyone's thinking about how do we protect ourselves from the sorts of risks that password managers actually help us with. And one of the interesting discussions that came up is I'm looking at sort of the signs around the place. And like many organizations, there's signs about, always create strong, unique passwords and everything. And I sort of said to them, I was like, okay, well, do you give people the tools to be able to do that? and they said, no, actually, we don't. It's like, well, you've got the posters though, and the posters say you've got to do this. How do you actually expect people to do that? Well, as it turns out, you kind of can't do that with the tooling that the people are given. So, that is a really paradoxical thing. And I think this is what we often see in security. We sort of see one sort of formal corporate view of the way it should be done and something else in practice, which is not always analogous to the objectives. Now, also having said that, I do go into a lot of organizations where they do actually have formalized enterprise level password managers. So things like 1Password for Teams. There are tools out there which are designed to run in the organization under a sort of corporate sanctioned mechanism. So the tooling is out there. It's just that we don't see it enough, and it's at odds with the objective of the organization in terms of the way they think people should create passwords.
Yeah, so I think that's a great concept, and also importantly, the thing I would add is that if you can get to the C-suite within the organization so that they understand and accept, and the policy flows down as opposed to flowing up or coming from the security officers, I think that helps in that whole process. So absolutely. So in your travels and experiences, obviously you see a wide range of companies, practices. Tell us about the good things that you picked up. Tell us about the bad things that you've seen. That I mean, we're aware of all the sort of post-its and so forth, but anything that stood out to you that wouldn't have occurred to you, or when you saw it, you go, "Wow, I hadn't thought about that as a bad practice," and also good practices that you've seen.
Well, I think things like the security posters are good examples of bad practice. And sort of recalling a point I just made there, that the bad practices as a theme within organizations tend to break down into where on the one hand, there is this corporate set of objectives about security. And on the other hand, there's a practical reality which is not consistent with those objectives. So the posters are one good example. I certainly saw these in my old life working for a healthcare company, the world's largest healthcare company. We would see these posters around, create strong, unique passwords. Good luck, and they wouldn't give you the tooling. The other things that I would see along those lines as well is the annual corporate security training. Once a year, you're going to sit there, you're going to watch these videos, you're going to answer a quiz at the end. And what everyone would do is they would play the videos in the background because the videos had to play, and then they'd actually do real work. And then you'd get to the questions. And the questions would be something like, Vladimir from Moscow calls up and requires $20,000 to pay an invoice. Should you send it to him, yes or no? and you're looking at this going, well, I'm glad I didn't waste my time watching these videos. I will answer the question. And what it does is it ticks some compliance officer's box. And the compliance officer says, well, everyone got trained. I don't know how we got owned. It's insurance for the organization. There's still a lot of that around where it's like, let's just do our annual security check. And even thinking about things like our views around authentication. So again, getting back to the premise of there is an organizational requirement, and then there's the reality of what objectives it meets. Authentication, we have typically thought of as being something where we have to change our passwords every 3 months. Most organizations still say you've got to change your passwords every 3 months. And now we know from the likes of the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK that this is bad advice because it forces bad habits. So regardless of whether the NCSC and NIST and a whole bunch of organizations come out and say don't mandate password rotation without suspicion of compromise, you've still got everyone from just about every corporate entity through to PCI saying you've got to rotate your passwords. So I find it very curious to see, again, this sort of impedance of corporate objectives versus the practical reality of what their guidelines are mandating. I guess if we flip it around the other side and to your question of what do I see working well, one of the things that I am increasingly seeing in organizations now is ongoing organic security assessments, for want of a better term. So a really good example of this is phishing simulations. So there are services out there like Fish5 where you can run a phishing simulation within your organization. And what this starts to do is it gets away from saying, hey, every December we're going to do like the corporate security training and we'll just, everyone will pass and we'll tick their boxes, to let's consistently throughout the year send phishing simulations across the organization, see who falls for it, and if they do, then that's a learning opportunity. And now what happens is security training is an organic part of the day-to-day business as opposed to a box ticking exercise. So I think that's one of the positive things I've seen.
Absolutely. I'm
so
sorry.
Everyone that does that, they're like, yeah, this is really good. It works fantastically. And there are services out there to help you automate the whole thing, figure out who needs a little bit of extra help. Some organizations even gamify it a little bit. They build it into objectives. They give incentives if people do a good job. So they're really good. And the other one, which is starting to gain more and more traction, which I think works fantastically for organizations, particularly with externally facing websites, is bug bounties. So bug bounties are getting a lot more traction these days because we've sort of, I think we're gradually reaching the realization as an industry that sometimes we have problems, like sometimes we do write bad code. It would be nice to know about it when we write bad code. Let's incentivize those who may find it to talk to us privately instead of doing other nefarious things. And let's also invite in people who are very, very good at finding the sorts of issues which plague so many websites, and we'll incentivize them for that. And companies like BugCrowd are doing a fantastic job in actually running these as a service as well. Now, I think, frankly, we're still really, really early days, and every time I talk to an organization about this, they're still like, oh, we're a bit worried, like people might try and hack us. And I sort of say, well, I hate to break this to you, but yeah, check your logs.
So for those of you just joining, I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and today I'm delighted to be talking to Troy Hunt, information security author and instructor and founder of HaveIBeenPwnd. Troy was just sharing some of the positive experiences. The phishing simulation, is a constant process. I think one of the things that I would highlight or pick up about that that you specifically said, which is learning opportunity, not punishment opportunity. That's one of the things that bothers me a lot about any kind of root cause analysis. It's a struggle that we have in healthcare. They fixed it in the airlines so that they go after the root cause and don't try and apportion blame or go through a blame storming exercise. And I think that's one of the things that, has the potential to occur. But I agree, a sort of continuous process in that. So, you talked a little bit about the good experiences, the opportunity to include good tools. You said specifically that the password will continue. I want to push back because I saw something from Frank Abagnale, Catch Me If You Can, who specifically said the password's dead. I know lots of people have said that. Why do you think the password will continue? Is there no transition to biometrics and alternative means of authentication versus the password? You really think it's going to continue to persist?
Well, let's look at this in two ways. So first of all, if for anyone saying the password's dead, ask yourself this question: do you have less passwords today than what you did a year ago?
Right.
And, the answer is no. Second of all, biometrics. So, I got an iPhone X last year. Incidentally, doesn't work real good in Australia, where it's really, really bright, and I always wear sunglasses. In fact, it's absolutely terrible here. But that's another story.
That's true.
In terms of biometrics, I get the phone. It's all going to be Face ID, right? So, you won't need passwords, etc. Take the phone out of the box. What's the first thing you got to do? You got to put the phone on your Wi-Fi network. All right, well, there's one password. So, number one. And then you connect to the Wi-Fi network and it says, all right, cool. So now what you need to do is restore your old phone from iCloud because you want to persist all your data. Okay, well, there's your next password. And then you get to the bit where you set up the biometrics and it says, we need a fallback position. Can you create another password, which is a PIN? So now I haven't even used the phone yet, but I'm 3 passwords in. Now, having said that, once that's set up and once you're in a country without as much sunshine as Australia, most of the time when you authenticate to your phone, you're using biometrics. Or say I've got an iPad Pro and I always use Touch ID on that. Works great most of the time. So yeah, I'm now in a position where I can unlock the device in front of other people. They can look over my shoulder. I was thinking just the other day when I was traveling, I was sitting in a lounge in Dubai, and it's like, I don't care if the cameras can see what I'm doing because I'm using my finger on my PCs and my face on my phone. This is fantastic. I still have passwords on all those devices. I have more passwords than I've ever had before. I don't have a choice, but the prevalence with which I need to use them is decreasing. And I think that's the real value proposition of biometrics. It's not that it kills passwords, it just means we don't have to touch them as frequently.
Yeah, I think great point. I mean, I agree with you. I think I've got more. I haven't done a tally in my password manager, but I think it's pretty long. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I want to close out and offer you an opportunity to provide, one or two small things that we can do in our personal lives, in our professional lives, that can help us be more secure.
Well, password manager is definitely the first step. The second step is two-factor, multi-step, MFA, whatever we want to call it, different names in different contexts. But having something beyond passwords as a second phase of authentication is really, really important. And look, most major services these days, other than banks, it still blows me away. Like I've got two-step verification on Twitter and Facebook and all these sorts of things. My bank is like, nah, give us 4 numbers, you'll be fine. Now, having said that, banks do a lot of other security things as well. But definitely using two-factor is a major thing. The other thing, and I'm going to be careful how I say this because people get upset, is being conscious about what we digitize. And this is a little bit of a, I guess, operational security for everyone. And an example of this is, I use Facebook to share things with my friends, as many people do. I like to share photos of my kids. I'm not going to have any photos of my kids that I wouldn't. Let me rephrase it. Instead of saying I wouldn't, I'm not going to take photos of my kids which would cause any great embarrassment to them or myself if they're public. And the reason why I'm saying I've got to be careful about how I put it is that people very quickly descend into accusing you of victim blaming if you say that. So, I've often said, look, we all make our own risk decisions with security, and there are some things we can do that are riskier than others. And we've got to be conscious that part of securing our own sort of security posture is to take some preventative measures. So whether that be photos of yourself in compromising positions or photos of your family. I'm always cautious not to put anything that would cause any great problems if it went public. And I think that's very common sense, practical advice.
Fantastic. So it remains for me to thank you, Troy, for joining me on the show. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thanks for coming on.
No worries, Nick. Thanks for the invite, mate.
Thanks for joining me today. Do you have any better ideas, or have you found a small incremental change that's brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, the Incrementalist, or share with me at Dr. Nick1 on Twitter. You can find more information about the show on our program page at healthcarenowradio.com. And tune in next time to hear my discussions with leaders and innovators from around the globe who've revolutionized their space by using small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and I'm starting a revolution through evolution.